In this final subunit, we are going to do something slightly different from what we have done so far. Up to this point, we have focused on misunderstanding. We tried to understand why questions of authorship and contribution are confusing, and why, within real academic systems, those confusions can gradually become normalized. We examined ideals, structures, and pressures. Now, however, we need to pause that effort of examination. We need to slow it down and deliberately shift our stance. At this moment, understanding alone is no longer enough. We have to face a more difficult but a more necessary question. Under the most ambiguous and high-pressure research conditions, what are the boundaries of a researcher must not cross? This subunit is where reflection becomes uncomfortable. It asks us to stop examining and stop drawing lines. What follows is not about finding elegant solutions, and it is not about navigating every gray area. It is about identifying the minimal ethical threshold that defines whether the researcher's role can still be sustained. This is why this final part matters. Without such boundaries, everything becomes negotiable, and the concept of integrity quietly dissolves. Before we go any further, let me be very clear about the purpose of this part. What follows is not advice on optimization. It is not about how to maximize outcomes, publications, or career advantages. It is about a checklist. It's not about a checklist or best practice, and it is not a guideline for negotiation. Instead, this is the clarification of what compromises must stop. In earlier parts of this hour, we allow complexity, pressure, and ambiguity to remain visible. Here, we deliberately limit the flexibility. We are not asking what is ideal, what is realistic, and what is non-negotiable. This decision is crucial. Ethical discussions often fail because everything is treated as context-dependent. If a decision is framed as situational, then no boundary ever holds. The purpose of this subunit is to resist that slide. We are identifying points at which ethical justification collapses regardless of context. This is not because context doesn't matter anymore. It is because without limits, context becomes an excuse rather than an explanation. Let's return to the two stories we discussed at the beginning of this hour. This time, we will not repeat the details. We already know them. Instead, we're asking a different question. We are no longer asking why the situations were confusing, where each story is closest to the red line. This change in question is subtle but important. It shifts our attention from uncertainty to proximity. These stories are no longer illustrations of ambiguity. They become indicators of risk. By revisiting them in this way, we can see that ethical problems do not usually begin with clear violations. They begin with movement. They begin with steps that feel acceptable, reasonable, and even justifiable at the time. Asking whether the red line appears forces us to examine those steps more carefully. It also reminds us that red lines are often visible only in retrospect, which make it even more important to define them clearly in advance. These stories are no longer about confusions. They are about proximity. They show us the red lines are rarely crossed suddenly. More often, they are slowly approached. Through a series of decisions that appear reasonable at the time they are made. Each decision on its own may not trigger alarm. Each one can be explained, can be defended. But when viewed together, a pattern emerges. What these stories reveal is not dramatic misconduct, it's gradual erosion. Ethical boundaries do not disappear overnight, they fade. They're worn down by repetition, by silence, and by rationalization. This is precisely why red lines are difficult to identify in real time. When nothing feels extreme, it becomes tempting to believe that nothing is wrong. These stories remind us ethical failure often looks ordinary from the inside. Recognizing proximity rather than only violations is therefore a crucial ethical skill. At this point, we need to be clear about what we mean by a red line. A red line is not defined by university regulations or general policies. Those rules matter, but they are not what we are talking about here. A red line refers to the moment when you can no longer reasonably claim that you are still acting as a researcher. In other words, this is not a technical issue. It is a question of rule It is a question of rule corruption. The researcher role is defined by responsibility, accountability, and intellectual honesty. Where those elements can no longer be sustained, the role itself breaks down. A red line marks that breakdown. It is not about whether a policy has been violated. It is not about whether the ethical identity of the researcher can still defend it. This is why red lines remain relevant, even when formal rules are unclear, incomplete, or silent. They operate in a deeper level than compliance. The first type of red line appears where authorship is separated from academic responsibility. This happens when some aspects of the benefit and recognition associated with authorship, but distances themselves from the research when questioning arise about method, analysis, and conclusions. The issue here is not the size of contribution. It is not about who did more work or who spent more time. It is a matter of raw integrity. At its core, authorship is not about having participated in a process. It is about being willing to stand at the front of the research and take responsibility for it. This includes responsibility for decisions you agreed to, for results you endorsed, and for conclusions that carry your name. Once this willingness disappears, authorship becomes hollow. The name remains, but the rule doesn't. At that point, the researcher's role itself begins to break down. This is the red line because it transforms authorship into a shield rather than a responsibility. When that happens, integrity is no longer defensible. The second type of red line emerges when the rule or power asymmetry are used to obtain silence. In unequal relationships, silence does not necessarily mean consent. If someone knows that the other party lacks of real freedom to refuse because of dependency, evaluation, or future risk, yet still chooses not to clarify authorship responsibility, then the absence of objection cannot be treated as ethical valid agreement. In such situations, ambiguity is not natural. It becomes a tool. It shifts responsibility onto the vulnerable party when protecting their interests from the more powerful one. This is a red line because it exploits structural imbalance rather than merely existing with it. Ethical research relationships require active responsibility, not passive avoidance. When silence is treated as consent, despite known asymmetry, the ethical burden is displaced rather than shared. Let displacement signals a collapse of ethical responsibility at the relational level. The third type of red line appears when ambiguity is deliberately maintained for convenience. Phrases such as let's deal with authorship later, or we will clarify this after the paper is accepted, may sound practical. They may sound harmless. They often appear reasonable under pressure, but they all rely on the same assumption, placing short-term convenience, avoiding and above the academic integrity. Delay is not a natural choice. It is itself a form of responsibility shifting. By post-form clarification, responsibility is deferred, obscured, and eventually contested. When begin as convenience can easily become strategic silence. This is the red line because it turns ambiguity into an instrument. Instead, addressing uncertainty responsibly, it is preserved because it benefits someone in the short term. Once ambiguity is maintained intentionally, ethical justification weakened. Integrity requires timely clarity, not convenient delayed. When we took these red lines together, they can be summarized as strict but simple forms of self-constraints. Regardless how complex the system is or how intense the pressure may be, a researcher must at least hold on to three principles. First, do not accept an authorship role that you are not willing to stand behind. Second, do not use role advantage to exchange clarity for silence. Third, do not place temporary convenience, avoid academic integrity. These are not comprehensive rules. They do not solve everyday dilemma we face, but they represent the minimal threshold for maintaining the researcher role. Falling behind this threshold does not mean a mistake was made. It means the ethical identity of the researcher has been compromised. This is why these principles are non-negotiable. Let's return on one last time to the discomfort we felt at the beginning of this hour. In those stories, everything seemed reasonable at the time. No one felt that they clearly done something wrong, and yet something felt unsettled. That discomfort is not a weakness, it is a signal. Over the course of this hour, we established an ideal model. We examined why reality distorts it, and we identified the boundaries that must not be crossed. And when facing decisions about authorship and contribution, you may not always be able to make the best possible choice. Constraints are real, pressure is real, but before making any decisions, there is at least one question you should always be able to answer honestly. In this decision, am I willing to stand behind this research? If the answer is no, then no matter how reasonable the decision may appear, it has already crossed a line rather than researcher's role cannot sustain. The end of this section.